Wharton management professor Peter Cappelli joins us today to talk about the job market. Thanks for joining us today, Peter.
Thank you.
Is it a good idea for potential employees, people looking for work, to be thinking about temporary positions?
Oh, I think so. And I think, for entry-level jobs, for people leaving school, let's say, this has been a pretty standard way to get a job for quite a while. Even when the economy was more robust, the idea of going work for a temp agency and then eventually getting hired was pretty standard, pretty routine. So my guess is it'll be even more important now because full-time hiring is not happening.
Are there specific sectors in the economy, perhaps green technology, that have or are likely to be producing more jobs for the rest of 2009 and into 2010?
Well, I think the answer is sure. The problem is, do we know which ones they are? And the answer to that is no. This is sort of you're placing bets, and you're placing bets on what part of the economy is going to grow fastest. I don't think we know. I think if you're a job seeker, the way to think about this is that it's much like trying to play the stock market, and that is, it isn't just whether you're trying to find where you think more jobs are. You're trying to find those opportunities where more jobs are that not everybody else knows about, right? Mm-hmm. So the same thing in the stock market. If you know a company is growing, but everybody knows that, you're not going to make any money on that. You want to find those companies that are going to grow and nobody else seems to understand that. So you'd like to find those situations where there are going to be opportunities and everybody's not swarming them. One of the peculiar things we found a few years ago, for example, was that there were great career opportunities in the previous couple of decades in the steel industry. People got to advanced careers there, executive jobs, faster in steel than in a lot of other industries, even those that were growing fast. And the reason was in part because not a lot of people were going to the steel industry. But sometimes, too, there are a lot of opportunities simply where things are in transition. When companies are changing their focus, where there's a lot of restructuring going on, there could be some real opportunities there, especially for people who have experience already. So my sense is this is kind of like the stock market. It's kind of like some aspects of sports. You kind of want to go where everybody else is not, right? And it may not be the thing to do to simply try to go where you think the jobs are. That's hard to predict anyway. But go where you think there may be opportunities where everybody's not swarming all over.
I see. There's been a lot of discussion in recent years about the emergence of a freelance economy in which workers take on specific kinds of short-term projects for a variety of companies. Do you think the recession might hasten that kind of transition from relatively permanent employer-employee relationships?
I think so, for the reasons we described earlier, and that is employers are trying to hedge their bets. They don't want to make long-term commitments. I think there's another more general trend going on, and that is that companies find it difficult to plan, even in good times, because their business strategies are changing all the time, because product half-lives are shrinking down, and as a result, they find themselves changing directions much more frequently than in previous generations. And because of that, the work tends to be a little more short-term in its orientation, and it's much more conceivable to engage somebody to work on a discrete project than it is to hire them in and then think about this project or beyond this project, etc. So I think we're kind of moving in that direction anyway. And indeed, even some of the bigger temporary help firms, some of the bigger leased employee sort of firms, essentially are playing on that same idea. The original client company contracts with a temp firm or a leased employee firm to engage employees on a project-like basis. Sometimes the project can go out quite a long time, a year or two, but beyond that, the company may change directions and that entire skill set may become obsolete. So it's easier to move toward this gig model.
Now, employers used to pay a penalty for that in terms of training costs and that sort of thing. Is that penalty diminishing as the lifespan of products and strategies also shrinks?
Well, they're paying a penalty in the sense that they pay more per hour for the same workers. Mm-hmm. The cheapest way in terms of cost per hour to engage labor is to hire somebody full-time, but you're placing a bet then, and you're placing a bet that you'll need them for a long enough period of time for that to pay off. And if not, you end up with a big cost of having to let them go. and the severance costs and the legal costs and all that sort of stuff. So it's the case now that if you're hiring a temp worker from a temp agency, you're paying them more per hour, sometimes by a lot, 25 or 30% more, than you're paying your regular full-time employees. But for the employer, the reduction in uncertainty associated with that is worth it. I don't have to worry about the long-term bet, whether I'll need them for a year or 2 or 3. Even if I only need them for a few months, I can let them go without any cost to me. And so the per hour costs, I'm willing to pay a premium on that.
Does that premium include the cost of benefits for employees, full-time employees?
Yeah, even when you're including benefit costs, yeah. And some of the temp agencies, and particularly the leased employers, they build that in. They're paying their own people healthcare costs. They're charging the client company for that. So, you know, the clients are paying a premium per hour. They're willing to pay it to avoid the uncertainty and risk of a long-term relationship.
Okay. Now, in terms of employee flexibility, should people who are about to enter or have recently entered the job market be more prepared than they have in previous recoveries to consider jobs in other parts of the U.S. or even overseas, perhaps in emerging economies?
Yeah, I would say within the U.S., that's probably certainly true. I'd say one of the things that's been different about recessions in the last few years is that they have not been quite as national in scope as maybe they had been in previous generations. There's some parts of the country which have been, you know, in previous years a little better protected in previous recessions. You know, the oil industry was doing well. In Houston, people were flocking from the Midwest to Houston. This particular recession is a little different in that it's so national. It's not a particular industry that's down. Midwest seems to be hit particularly hard, construction especially hard. But because it's driven basically by credit problems, banks not lending, it's hitting the whole economy as a whole. So I'd say in comparison to, you know, some earlier recessions in the 80s, especially the 90s, where there were some pockets still doing pretty well, like oil, where you could pick up and move within the U.S., you really had some opportunities there. Some of that still now. It's not clear that's such a big deal. But leaving the country is an increasingly attractive option. And there are a lot of reasons for that. The main one is the rest of the world economy seems to be perking up much faster than the U.S. is, because the banking crisis that drove everything is still here. And so we're still having problems with credit. In Korea, for example, I was there a few weeks ago. The unemployment rate is down just a little below 4% now. If you go to places like India and China, there's an enormous demand for managerial talent. So I would say it's a great time to look for an opportunity outside the U.S., partly because inside the U.S. there's not so much, partly too because the wage rates in these other countries have risen a lot. We've just done a big project in India, and the Indian executives told us that for managerial positions in India, especially top positions, the rates of pay in India are about the same as they are in the U.S. now. So you're not taking a huge hit in wages by taking up some of these positions, and you're getting great experience on your resume and something that would increasingly be valuable back in the U.S. So I'd say that's one thing that really is different this time around. The opportunities to work outside the U.S. are much more attractive than probably at any previous time.
Now, with unemployment higher than 10%, it's been a very profound recession for workers of all kinds. Beyond those we've already discussed, temporary positions, working overseas, are there any other kinds of long-term structural changes in the labor market emerging from the recession, do you think?
Well, I think it's a little hard to say yet. I think one thing that we do know when you have a deep recession like this is that the people who enter the job market during this downturn, their experiences and to some extent their attitudes are fundamentally changed. You can see in the data that if you enter the workforce in a down economy, your wages over the course of your life will never fully recover compared to those folks who entered it in an upturn. It's also the case that you tend to be a little spooked by it for a long period of time. Employers would say, for example, that people who entered the job market in 1999 when the economy was booming and the dot-com fever was on, Even when the economy cooled off, they still had this sense of entitlement because that's what they experienced when they first entered. And my guess is that folks who enter it now will probably still have a sense of gratitude, even when the economy picks up a little bit. Now, that's not true of everybody. And I think employers who think that after this economy picks up again, employees will be grateful to have jobs and they will want security and they'll stay put, they're just wrong. It's just not going to happen.
It'll depend on when they entered the job market.
It may depend on when they're entered the job market. I'd say that kind of effect will occur only for those people who left college right in this period here. For people who are more mature and been out for a while, they're not necessarily going to have any great loyalty to their current employers. I don't think too many employers went out of their way to protect their employees in this downturn. I just saw some survey evidence from some consulting firms surveying employees, and the figures were something like between 40 and 60%, depending on the survey, of the current employees in the U.S. surveyed said that as soon as the economy recovered, they'd be looking to leave their current employer. So they don't feel a lot of gratitude to their current employer.
And you discussed this with us in a couple of articles that we did during the early part of the recession, the importance of trying to find ways, creative ways to hold on to employees. So it looks like perhaps employers are going to be paying a price if they didn't take those steps.
Oh yeah, I think employers have been remarkably short-sighted. I think the typical estimates of the costs of laying somebody off are the equivalent of about a year's salary in terms of replacement costs if you have to hire somebody back. In some fields where people have expert skills that are hard to replace, like law, for example, customer contacts, the estimates go as high as 5 times their annual salary. And if you're laying somebody off in those contexts and you expect that you'll have to fill the job again within a year or so, as some of these companies thought, they're just crazy, right? It's costing them more to lay the people off than it would be to just park them and pay them to do nothing. It's hard for them to think that way, I think, and to some extent they don't understand the arguments, and the people who do understand them, often in the human resource departments, are nervous about making them. So I'd say companies made a lot of mistakes. They'll pay a price for this. The question is whether they'll learn next time around, and jury's out on that, I guess.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming with us today. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.